Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a question that sounds completely ridiculous at first. Why medieval people may have had less stress than you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in a small English village sometime during the 13th century. Before you even open your eyes, you already know how your day is going to unfold. The church bell will ring before sunrise. The rooster will begin shouting at absolutely nothing. Your neighbour's cow will somehow wander into the wrong field again, despite this happening nearly every week. And by the time you've finished a simple breakfast, you'll already be walking toward the same fields you've worked since childhood. Exciting. Perhaps not. Predictable. Absolutely. And strangely enough, that's where your stress level begins to shrink. Today, you're expected to choose everything. Your career, your hobbies, your streaming service, your coffee, your mattress, your phone, your investment strategy. Even buying toothpaste somehow requires comparing 23 different options, each claiming to contain revolutionary minerals discovered by highly enthusiastic dentists. As a medieval villager, your biggest shopping dilemma is usually, does the baker still have bread? Problem solved. Your world is astonishingly small. To you, the village is the centre of existence. Beyond the surrounding woods lie a few neighbouring settlements, perhaps a market town a day's walk away, and then, well, somewhere out there is London. Probably. You've heard stories. Most people never travelled farther than a few miles from where they were born. Unless you became a soldier, a merchant, a pilgrim, or made the spectacularly poor decision to annoy the local lord, there was little reason to leave. At first, that sounds depressing. But think about what came with it. You weren't constantly comparing your life to thousands of strangers. You didn't wake up wondering why a blacksmith in France had already bought his third horse while you were still using the same stubborn mule. You didn't scroll through pictures of castles thinking, everyone seems to be vacationing in Tuscany except me. You had absolutely no idea what anyone in Tuscany was doing. Honestly, that alone might have lowered your blood pressure. Your comparisons stayed local. You knew the baker, the miller, the carpenter, the village priest, and the family whose pigs had somehow escaped for the third time this month. Their successes made sense, because you actually knew them. If the blacksmith built a larger house, you knew exactly why. He'd been working twice as hard for years, and frankly, everyone agreed he deserved it. Today, your brain processes thousands of people every single day. Social media, advertisements, breaking news, influencers, celebrities, billionaires, who apparently wake up at 4 a.m. to drink green juice and meditate on mountaintops before answering emails. Meanwhile, you're just trying to remember why you walked into the kitchen. Your brain never evolved for this. For almost all of human history, you lived in communities of perhaps 100 or 200 people. Those were the faces your mind was built to recognise, trust, gossip about, occasionally argue with, and then see again at church the following Sunday, pretending none of it had happened. Of course, medieval villagers still worried. Bad harvests, sick children, harsh winters, taxes, whether the cow was about to produce milk or simply kick you again. Life could be brutally difficult. But most of those worries were immediate and tangible. You could see them, touch them, and often do something about them. You weren't lying awake worrying about stock markets on another continent, political arguments between strangers, or an email marked urgent sent at 9:38 on a Friday evening. In many ways, your mental world was as small as your physical one. You knew the rhythm of the seasons, the names of your neighbours, and exactly what tomorrow was likely to bring. There was comfort in that certainty. It may not have been glamorous, but it gave your mind something modern life rarely offers anymore: permission to stop looking over the horizon for the next thing to worry about. If you wanted to know what tomorrow looked like in medieval Europe, you didn't need a calendar app, a smartwatch, or 3 reminder notifications politely informing you that you were already behind schedule. You simply looked out the window. If it was spring, you planted. If it was summer, you tended the crops. If it was autumn, you harvested. If it was winter, you repaired tools, mended clothes, chopped wood, and tried not to complain too loudly about how cold your toes had become. Every season came with its own instructions. That rhythm mattered far more than most people realise. Modern psychologists often point out that routine reduces anxiety because it makes the future feel predictable. Your brain spends less energy wondering what comes next when it already knows the answer. Medieval people didn't invent this principle. It simply became the structure of everyday life. The sun decided when your workday began. The church bell announced the important moments. The changing seasons dictated your priorities. Nature, rather than your inbox, was your manager. You didn't wake up asking yourself whether today was the perfect day to reinvent your career. You already had one. You didn't spend 45 minutes deciding whether to answer emails before breakfast or meditate first. You probably spent 45 minutes trying to convince a stubborn donkey that crossing a shallow stream was not, in fact, the greatest danger humanity had ever faced. Every village moved almost like a single organism. When dawn arrived, everyone became busy together. When evening came, life gradually slowed. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Families gathered indoors. Candles burned sparingly because wax wasn't cheap, and darkness politely suggested that perhaps it was time to stop working. Imagine that. The setting sun actually meant your boss couldn't contact you anymore. Granted, your boss might have been a feudal lord instead of a regional manager, which had its own disadvantages, but at least he couldn't schedule an emergency meeting after supper. Routine also removed countless tiny decisions. Today, you decide what to wear from wardrobes overflowing with options. Medieval clothing was considerably simpler. You owned work clothes. You owned better clothes for church or special occasions. That was largely the end of the fashion crisis. No standing in front of a mirror whispering, "I have nothing to wear," while surrounded by enough fabric to outfit half the village. Meals followed similar patterns. Breakfast, when taken, was modest. Midday brought the main meal for many labourers. Supper came before darkness settled in. Seasonal foods appeared when nature allowed them, not because strawberries had somehow flown across the planet in the middle of January. There was comfort in these repetitions. Of course, routine didn't eliminate hardship. Harvest season could be exhausting. Winter could feel endless. Storms could destroy months of work overnight. But even those difficulties fit into a familiar cycle that generations had experienced before you. You weren't navigating an entirely new problem every week. Instead, you inherited rhythms that your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents already understood. They knew when to sow, when to reap, when to celebrate, and when to endure. Life still surprised you from time to time, but far less often than your smartphone does before you've even finished your morning cup of coffee. One of the biggest sources of stress in modern life is a question medieval people rarely asked. Am I doing enough with my life? Today, you're expected to discover your passion, build a career around it, maintain a healthy work-life balance, develop 5 interesting hobbies, stay physically fit, learn another language, invest for retirement, travel the world, and somehow become the best possible version of yourself before turning 35. No pressure. In the Middle Ages, life usually came with a much shorter instruction manual. If your father was a farmer, there was an excellent chance you would become one too. If your mother spun wool, brewed ale, or baked bread, you would probably learn those same skills from childhood. If your family worked for the village mill, you likely knew exactly where you'd be working long before your 10th birthday. Your future wasn't hidden behind endless possibilities. It was standing right in front of you. That sounds restrictive because, honestly, it was. Social mobility certainly existed, but it was rare. A talented apprentice could become a respected craftsman. A clever boy might enter the church and receive an education. A fortunate merchant could build considerable wealth. Yet for most people, life followed familiar tracks that had existed for generations. Modern readers often focus on what medieval people lacked: freedom, opportunity, choice. Those are all fair observations. But fewer choices also meant fewer identity crises. You didn't spend years wondering whether farming truly reflected your authentic self. You were too busy trying to keep the chickens from eating next year's seeds. Your community also knew exactly who you were. You weren't expected to create a personal brand. You didn't need a carefully written biography explaining your values and career objectives. Nobody asked where you saw yourself in 5 years. If someone had, the answer probably would have been, hopefully still alive, and preferably with both cows. That was considered an ambitious yet realistic plan. Your identity came from relationships rather than achievements. You were someone's son or daughter, someone's husband or wife, someone's apprentice, someone's neighbour. Everyone knew your family, your reputation, and your place within the village. While that could feel limiting, it also provided something many people crave today: certainty. You belonged somewhere. There was very little pressure to reinvent yourself every few years. Modern society often celebrates constant reinvention: new career, new city, new goals, new image, new version of yourself. It can be exciting. It can also be exhausting. The medieval world valued consistency far more than novelty. Becoming dependable earned greater respect than becoming famous. A trustworthy carpenter, an honest baker, or a skilled shepherd contributed far more to village life than someone constantly chasing the next exciting opportunity. Of course, this system had serious drawbacks. If you dreamed of becoming something entirely different, society could make that nearly impossible. Many people lived and died without ever escaping the circumstances of their birth, so no, medieval life wasn't a paradise. But while you spend countless hours asking yourself who you should become, a medieval villager usually woke up already knowing exactly who they were. Oddly enough, certainty, even imperfect certainty, is remarkably calming for the human mind. If you had a bad day in the Middle Ages, there was a very good chance everyone in the village knew about it before sunset. Today, that sounds like a nightmare. Back then, it was often your safety net. Modern life celebrates independence. You're expected to solve your own problems, build your own career, manage your own finances, maintain your own mental health, and if possible, assemble your own furniture using instructions that appear to have been translated from ancient Latin by someone who had never actually seen a chair. Medieval life worked differently. You were rarely alone. Villages were small. Some contained only a few dozen families, while larger ones might have a couple of hundred people. You saw the same faces every single day. The baker wasn't a stranger behind a counter. The blacksmith wasn't just someone fixing your tools. The priest had probably baptized you, your parents, and possibly half your cousins. Everyone knew everyone, including everyone's business. Privacy was, let's call it, limited. If you argued with your husband, your neighbour probably heard it. If your goat escaped and ate someone's cabbage, the entire village would somehow know before lunchtime. If you tripped into a muddy ditch on the way home from the tavern, congratulations, you had just become next week's entertainment. Embarrassing? Certainly. Lonely? Not often. When disaster struck, the community usually stepped in because survival depended on cooperation. If your house caught fire, neighbours formed bucket lines. If you became ill, relatives and nearby families often helped with harvesting your crops. If someone died, the village gathered not only for the funeral but also to support the family left behind. Helping wasn't simply kindness. It was insurance. One day you might be helping your neighbour repair his roof. Next winter he might be helping you pull your wagon out of the mud after your horse decided it had suddenly forgotten how legs worked. This constant cooperation created something psychologists now recognise as one of the strongest protectors against chronic stress: social connection. Human beings evolved in tribes, not apartments where you can live next door to someone for 5 years and still only know them as the person who occasionally vacuums at strange hours. Medieval people couldn't disappear into isolation very easily. Sometimes they probably wished they could. Imagine trying to avoid awkward conversations when every path through the village passes directly by people who have known you since you were born. There was no pretending you were just keeping a low profile. Old Margaret would simply knock on your door and ask why she hadn't seen you at church, and she'd expect an answer. Of course, village life wasn't one endless festival of friendship. People argued over land, animals, inheritance, marriages, taxes, and whose pigs had once again wandered into someone else's vegetable patch. Grudges could last for years. Gossip spread faster than a horse at full gallop. And unlike today's rumours, there was no convenient mute conversation button. Yet beneath all the disagreements existed something surprisingly valuable. You belonged. Whether you liked every member of your community or not, you were woven into it. People depended on you, and you depended on them. That sense of belonging gave many medieval villagers something modern psychologists consider essential for emotional well-being. The comforting knowledge that when life became difficult, you probably wouldn't face it entirely by yourself. Picture this. You've spent the entire day working in the fields. Your back aches, your boots are caked in mud, and you've probably argued with at least one particularly stubborn sheep who continues to believe your vegetable garden belongs to him. The sun begins to sink toward the horizon, and something remarkable happens. Your workday actually ends. Not because you've finished every task. There were always more weeds to pull, fences to repair, or tools to sharpen. It ends because nature has made the decision for you. Once darkness falls, trying to continue working becomes impractical unless you enjoy accidentally hitting your thumb with a hammer by candlelight. For most medieval people, daylight was the office clock. When the light disappeared, productivity naturally slowed. Today, work follows you everywhere. Your phone buzzes during dinner. Your laptop sits on the kitchen table. Your smartwatch gently reminds you that although you've just finished working for 9 hours, perhaps now would be an excellent time to answer one more email. Modern technology has quietly erased the boundary between work and rest. A medieval farmer had no such luxury or problem. No messenger arrived after sunset announcing, "Quick question," followed by 6 pages of additional responsibilities. No lord sent a pigeon requesting revisions to yesterday's harvest report before sunrise. And thankfully, there was no medieval version of "this meeting could have been an email." When evening arrived, the entire village gradually shifted gears. Animals were fed. Tools were put away. Smoke rose from cottages as simple meals were prepared. Families gathered around the fire, sharing bread, pottage, cheese, or whatever the season had provided. Children listened to stories they had already heard dozens of times, but somehow still found entertaining. Adults repaired clothing, carved wooden tools, spun wool, or simply talked. Conversation wasn't competing with televisions. No one glanced at a glowing screen halfway through your story about the unusually ambitious goose that chased the blacksmith across the village green. If someone interrupted you, they had the decency to do it in person. Even sleep followed a healthier rhythm than many of us experience today. Without electric lighting, most people naturally became tired soon after darkness settled in. Historians believe many medieval Europeans practiced what is sometimes called segmented sleep, waking briefly during the night before falling asleep again. Whether or not that was universal, their bodies remained closely tied to natural light rather than artificial schedules. Your brain evolved for exactly this pattern. Sunlight tells it when to be alert. Darkness tells it when to slow down. Today, many of us confuse our brains by staring into bright screens until midnight, and then wondering why sleep refuses to arrive. Apparently, your ancestors' greatest evening distraction was occasionally hearing someone outside yell, "Has anyone seen my pig?" Of course, medieval evenings weren't always peaceful. A storm might threaten the harvest. A sick child could keep an entire household awake. Winter nights were long, cold, and sometimes filled with worry, but there was still one enormous difference from modern life. Rest wasn't something you had to schedule. It arrived every evening with the setting sun, quietly reminding you that tomorrow's work could wait until tomorrow. If you walked into a medieval home and asked, "So, what are my options today?" the answer would probably be wonderfully short. You can eat what's in the pot. You can wear what's hanging on that peg. You can do the work that needs doing. That's about it. Modern life is built on choice. We like to think more choices automatically make us happier, but psychologists have discovered something called the paradox of choice. Once you have too many options, your brain starts working overtime. Instead of feeling free, you begin worrying that you've chosen the wrong one. Sound familiar? You spend 15 minutes deciding what film to watch, only to spend the entire evening scrolling through trailers instead. Congratulations! You have experienced a problem that would completely confuse a medieval peasant. In the Middle Ages, your wardrobe was refreshingly uncomplicated. Most ordinary people owned only a handful of garments: a linen shirt or shift, woolen clothes for everyday work, a cloak for colder weather. Better clothing reserved for church, weddings, or major feast days. Nobody stared into a chest full of clothes, sighing dramatically, "I have absolutely nothing to wear." If you did say that, your wife would simply point at the shirt you wore yesterday, and the day before, and probably tomorrow. Fashion certainly existed, especially among nobles and wealthy merchants. Kings loved luxurious fabrics, bright dyes, and extravagant clothing that loudly announced, "Look how rich I am." But for the vast majority of society, practicality won every time. The same simplicity applied to food. You didn't debate between Italian, Japanese, Mexican, or Indian takeaway. Dinner depended almost entirely on the season. Fresh vegetables appeared when they grew. Bread was baked from available grain. Cheese came from local animals. Meat was an occasional luxury for many families rather than an everyday expectation. You ate what nature provided, not what happened to be on special offer after comparing 14 restaurant reviews. Even careers involved remarkably few decisions. Most children learned the occupation of their parents or entered apprenticeships arranged through family connections. You weren't constantly wondering whether becoming a blacksmith would make you happier than becoming a cooper while secretly dreaming of launching a successful candle-making business. Life was already busy enough. Of course, fewer choices didn't always mean greater happiness. Sometimes people desperately wanted opportunities they could never have. A gifted farmer might have dreamed of becoming a scholar. A talented girl might have wished to become a physician. Society often closed those doors long before they could even knock. That lack of freedom was undeniably frustrating. But for the countless small decisions that quietly exhaust us every day, medieval life offered remarkable relief. There were fewer purchases to research, fewer life paths to compare, fewer advertisements convincing you that happiness was only one expensive purchase away. Nobody tried selling you a revolutionary new wooden bucket that would completely transform your lifestyle. Your old bucket carried water just fine. Perhaps that's the greatest irony. Medieval people owned far less than we do, yet they also spent far less time wondering whether they should own something different. Their minds were occupied by living life, not constantly optimizing it. Sometimes, having fewer options leaves far more room for peace. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your crops have begun to fail. The weather has been strange for weeks. Your youngest child has developed a fever. The village well tastes a little different. Nobody knows exactly why any of it is happening. Today you would probably do what most of us do. Search the internet. 5 minutes later, you've somehow convinced yourself that your tomatoes have an exotic fungus previously seen only on one remote island. Your headache is definitely something catastrophic, and your symptoms match 17 different illnesses that all require immediate attention. Your anxiety has increased by approximately 200%. A medieval villager didn't have that option. Instead, they had something else. Faith. Whether you lived in England, France, Germany, or much of Christian Europe, religion wasn't simply something you practiced on Sundays. It was the framework that explained almost everything around you. Good harvests, bad harvests, storms, illness, recovery, birth, death, even the changing seasons all fit into a larger story that people understood from childhood. Life might not always make sense, but it always had meaning. Modern psychology has repeatedly found that uncertainty is one of the greatest drivers of stress. Humans are surprisingly good at coping with hardship when they believe there is a purpose behind it. What truly unsettles us is feeling that suffering is random, meaningless, or completely beyond explanation. For medieval people, uncertainty often had an answer. Perhaps God was testing your patience. Perhaps your village needed repentance. Perhaps this hardship would eventually lead to something better. Whether those explanations reflected objective reality isn't the point. The important part is that they offered emotional stability. Your mind wasn't endlessly chasing unanswered questions. It had somewhere to rest. Religion also filled the calendar with comforting rituals. Church bells marked the hours. Weekly services brought the community together. Imagine waking up tomorrow with one enormous realization. You no longer have to impress anyone. Not your boss. Not strangers on the internet. Not people from secondary school who somehow appear to own 3 holiday homes despite barely passing mathematics. In medieval society, your place in the world was usually decided long before you were old enough to worry about it. If you were born into a farming family, you were expected to farm. If your father was a carpenter, there was a good chance you'd spend your childhood learning how to shape timber instead of wondering whether you should become a motivational speaker. If your family belonged to the nobility, your responsibilities were different, but they were just as clearly defined. For most people, there wasn't an endless ladder waiting to be climbed. There was simply life. That sounds unfair because in many ways it absolutely was. A peasant couldn't simply decide to become a wealthy merchant overnight. A poor family couldn't usually send every child to university. Society placed firm limits on opportunity, and those limits could feel frustrating. But there was an unexpected side effect. You spent far less time measuring yourself against impossible standards. Today, comparison has become almost a full-time occupation. Someone your age has already started a successful company. Someone else has run a marathon. Someone is renovating a beautiful house while somehow still finding time to bake artisan bread and upload photographs of it before breakfast. Meanwhile, you're celebrating because you remembered where you left your keys. Modern life constantly introduces you to people who appear more successful than you. Your brain quietly keeps score. Medieval villagers had much smaller scoreboards. You compared yourself to people you actually knew. The blacksmith, the miller, the local priest, the wealthiest farmer. Their lives weren't carefully edited highlights designed to make every ordinary Tuesday look extraordinary. You saw the whole picture. You knew the blacksmith had injured his shoulder last winter. You knew the miller's roof leaked whenever it rained. You knew the wealthy farmer also had 6 children constantly eating everything in sight. Reality balanced comparison. There was another important difference. Success wasn't measured by endless growth. If your family had enough food, a solid roof, healthy animals, and a good reputation, many people considered themselves fortunate. The goal wasn't to become richer every single year. It was stability. To survive, to provide, to leave your children with a slightly better life than the one you inherited. That kind of success had limits. Modern ambition often doesn't. There is always another promotion, another investment, another qualification, another milestone that promises happiness just beyond the next achievement. It's like chasing the horizon. The closer you get, the farther away it seems. Medieval people certainly wanted better lives, but they also accepted something modern society often struggles to admit. Not everyone needed to become extraordinary. Being known as an honest neighbour, a reliable craftsman, or someone who always showed up when help was needed, carried genuine respect. You didn't need thousands of followers. You needed people who trusted you. Ironically, while medieval society offered far fewer opportunities, it also spared many people from one of today's greatest psychological burdens: the exhausting feeling that you should constantly be becoming someone else. Sometimes, simply being enough is one of the greatest luxuries a human mind can experience. After a long day of work, a medieval villager had an important decision to make. Should you listen to the travelling storyteller? Play a game of tables with your neighbours? Watch the village musicians? Or simply sit around the fire while your grandfather tells the same story about that enormous fish he almost caught 30 years ago? Spoiler alert. The fish became bigger every winter. Entertainment in the Middle Ages wasn't endless. That was precisely why it remained special. Today, entertainment never stops. Your television offers thousands of films. Your phone contains millions of videos. Music streams endlessly. News updates arrive every minute. Social media competes for every spare second of your attention, each app desperately trying to convince you that just 5 more minutes won't hurt. Then somehow it's 1 o'clock in the morning, and you've become deeply invested in a stranger restoring a castle in rural Wales. You don't even live in Wales. A medieval villager simply couldn't consume information at that speed. When the day's work ended, entertainment required people. Someone had to tell the story. Someone had to play the fiddle. Someone had to sing. Someone had to dance. And if nobody did, then everyone simply talked. Conversation itself became the evening's entertainment. People shared local news, family stories, legends, jokes and gossip. Plenty of gossip. In fact, if medieval villages had invented reality television, nobody would have watched it. They already had old Thomas explaining why the baker's daughter had been seen talking to the cooper's son behind the church for nearly 15 minutes. That was considered premium content. storytelling occupied a special place in medieval life. Long before books became common, history, folklore, heroic tales, and religious stories were passed from person to person. Children learned them by listening. Adults remembered them through repetition. A skilled storyteller could hold an entire room silent for hours using nothing more than a good voice and excellent timing. Your imagination did most of the work. Modern neuroscience suggests this is remarkably healthy. When you listen to a story without constant visual stimulation, your brain actively creates the images itself. You're participating rather than simply consuming. Today's entertainment often demands almost nothing from you except continued attention. The screen does all the imagining. Games were equally social. People played board games, dice games, chess among the wealthy, and countless local games that varied from village to village. Young people wrestled, raced, practiced archery, or played simple ball games in open fields. Nobody was counting steps. Nobody was trying to close fitness rings. You exercised because standing still all day would have seemed rather strange. Perhaps the greatest difference was that entertainment had clear endings. When the storyteller finished, he stopped. When the musicians packed away their instruments, the evening gradually came to an end. There wasn't an algorithm quietly whispering, "Since you enjoyed that, here are 347 more stories you absolutely must hear before sunrise." Instead, darkness settled over the village. The fire burned lower. People wished one another good night, and your mind, having enjoyed enough excitement for one evening, was finally allowed to become wonderfully, peacefully bored. Modern psychologists increasingly believe that boredom isn't a problem to eliminate, but a necessary pause that allows the brain to recover. Medieval people didn't schedule digital detox weekends or mindfulness retreats. Their world simply gave their attention room to breathe. By now, medieval life is beginning to sound surprisingly appealing. A slower pace, strong communities, predictable routines, no emails arriving at 11:30 at night asking if you've had a chance to look at this. It's tempting to imagine yourself happily settling into a cosy little cottage with a loaf of fresh bread and a warm fire. And then reality politely walks through the door. Because while medieval people may have experienced less chronic psychological stress than many of us do today, they faced a different kind of pressure altogether. One that was immediate. One that could not be postponed. One that could be deadly. If your harvest failed, you couldn't simply order groceries. If your roof collapsed during winter, there wasn't an emergency repair service promising to arrive between 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening. If your horse became lame halfway to the market, your carefully planned day had just become tomorrow's problem, assuming tomorrow cooperated. Modern life produces thousands of small stresses. Medieval life produced fewer, but much larger ones. The difference is important. Today your heart rate might spike because you've forgotten a password for an account you haven't used in 3 years. A medieval farmer's heart rate spiked because dark clouds appeared just before harvest, threatening to destroy months of work in a single afternoon. One problem was inconvenient. The other determined whether your family would have enough food during winter. Even ordinary accidents carried enormous consequences. A deep cut while chopping wood could become infected. A broken leg might prevent months of work. A simple toothache could become a serious illness. Suddenly, that terrifying annual visit to your dentist doesn't seem quite so unreasonable. You still won't enjoy it. But at least nobody is recommending that the treatment involve hot iron and enthusiastic prayers. Life expectancy also shaped people's outlook. Death was far more visible than it is today. Children sometimes died young. Diseases spread quickly. Mothers faced significant dangers during childbirth. Families became painfully familiar with grief in ways that are difficult for most modern societies to imagine. Yet strangely, this constant awareness of mortality sometimes encouraged a different perspective. Life felt fragile. That made ordinary moments matter more. Religious festivals, family meals, successful harvests, healthy children. These weren't taken for granted. They were celebrated because everyone understood how quickly circumstances could change. Modern people often postpone happiness. I'll relax after this project. I'll enjoy life once I get promoted. I'll spend more time with family next year. The finish line keeps moving. Medieval people couldn't always afford that illusion. Tomorrow was never guaranteed. So when the village gathered for a feast, people laughed. When musicians played, they danced. When friends shared ale around the fire, they stayed a little longer. Not because life was easy, but because they knew exactly how difficult it could become. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden beneath medieval life. Their world wasn't calmer because it lacked suffering. It was calmer because people accepted that suffering was part of life, rather than treating every hardship as evidence that life had somehow gone terribly wrong. That acceptance didn't remove pain, but it often prevented pain from becoming endless anxiety. For all the comforts we've explored so far, medieval life had one enormous disadvantage. When things went wrong, they really went wrong. There was very little middle ground. Most of the year followed familiar rhythms. You worked, worshipped, celebrated, and watched the seasons change. But every now and then, disaster arrived without warning, and suddenly, the peaceful routine that had kept your mind so steady disappeared almost overnight. The greatest source of stress wasn't everyday life. It was uncertainty. Imagine it's late summer. Your wheat is almost ready to harvest after months of hard work. You've watched the fields every day, knowing that in just another week your family should have enough grain to last through winter. Then dark clouds gather. The rain begins. Not for an afternoon, for days. The fields become rivers of mud. Grain begins to rot before it can be cut. Every hour you look out the window hoping the storm will stop. It doesn't. That isn't just disappointing. It's terrifying. Today, one bad paycheck might force you to tighten your budget for a while. A failed harvest could threaten an entire village. Food prices climbed quickly after poor harvests. Bread became expensive. Families stretched every meal a little further. Even wealthy nobles worried when several bad seasons followed one another because hungry peasants were rarely cheerful peasants. And history repeatedly proves that hungry people eventually stop asking politely. Then there was disease. Modern stress often comes from anticipating problems that never happen. Medieval disease had the unpleasant habit of actually arriving. A fever spreading through the village wasn't something you followed through news reports. It was happening next door. You watched neighbours disappear from daily life. Church bells rang more often. Familiar houses remained strangely quiet. Nobody understood bacteria or viruses. Doctors worked with the best knowledge available, but much of medicine relied on balancing bodily humours, herbal remedies, experience, and a generous amount of hope. Hope, unfortunately, was difficult to prescribe. War brought another layer of anxiety. Even if you weren't a soldier, armies rarely travelled without affecting everyone around them. Fields could be trampled, livestock stolen, villages looted. Refugees arrived carrying frightening stories from places only a few days away. Suddenly, your quiet little corner of the world didn't feel so safe anymore. Yet, here's something remarkable. When these crises passed, people generally returned to ordinary life astonishingly quickly. The fields still needed planting. Children still laughed. markets reopened. Church bells rang once again for weddings instead of funerals. Life moved forward because it had to. Perhaps modern society sometimes struggles more after hardship, because we expect life to remain comfortable all the time. Medieval people never had that expectation. They knew peace was precious precisely because it was fragile. Their greatest stress didn't come from constant low-level pressure. It came in powerful waves, famine, plague, war, harsh winters, and then, whenever fortune allowed, everyday life slowly reclaimed its familiar rhythm. And when that ordinary rhythm returned, people embraced it with a gratitude that many of us only discover after our own lives have been unexpectedly turned upside down. Here's the funny part. If you described parts of medieval life to a modern psychologist without mentioning castles, knights, or the occasional plague, they might nod approvingly and say, yes, those are excellent habits for reducing stress. No, seriously. Over the last few decades, researchers have spent thousands of hours studying what makes people happier, calmer, and more resilient. Again and again, they keep arriving at conclusions that would have sounded remarkably familiar to an ordinary medieval villager. Start with sleep. Scientists now know that natural sunlight helps regulate your body's internal clock. Spending time outdoors in the morning improves sleep quality, boosts mood, and lowers stress hormones. A medieval farmer would probably shrug. Well, yes. He'd been outside since sunrise because cows have never been particularly interested in respecting weekends. Then there's exercise. Today, millions of people drive to a building full of exercise machines so they can walk on a moving belt while watching someone else hike through a forest on a television. A medieval peasant would find this deeply confusing. You paid to pretend you're walking? Physical activity wasn't a separate part of medieval life. It was life. People walked almost everywhere. They lifted, carried, chopped, dug, climbed, planted, harvested, and repaired things nearly every day. Their bodies moved constantly, not because they were chasing fitness goals, but because everyday survival required it. Modern medicine consistently shows that regular movement reduces anxiety, depression, and chronic stress. The medieval villagers accidentally discovered this several centuries before treadmills appeared. Community is another fascinating example. Study after study has found that close friendships and strong social relationships are among the greatest predictors of long-term happiness. People surrounded by supportive communities generally recover from hardship more quickly and experience lower levels of chronic stress. That sounds remarkably similar to village life. Your neighbours weren't optional. Sometimes they were annoying. Sometimes they borrowed your tools and returned them in a condition that raised uncomfortable questions. But they were there. And when life became difficult, they usually showed up. Researchers also emphasize the importance of routine. Predictable daily habits reduce mental fatigue because your brain spends less energy making endless decisions. Sound familiar? The medieval calendar was practically one long routine, interrupted by harvest festivals, and the occasional goose chasing someone across the village square. Even gratitude has become a major area of psychological research. People who regularly appreciate ordinary parts of life often report greater happiness and lower stress. Medieval people rarely needed reminders to appreciate a successful harvest, a healthy child, or a warm meal after winter. They knew exactly how easily those blessings could disappear. Of course, modern science also reminds us of something equally important. Let's keep antibiotics. Let's keep clean drinking water. Let's keep vaccines, anesthesia, washing machines, and the remarkable luxury of living in a world where cutting your finger while slicing bread usually doesn't become the defining medical event of the year. The goal isn't to return to medieval life. It's to recognise that while technology has solved countless physical problems, it hasn't automatically solved the problems inside our minds. Perhaps the healthiest future isn't about choosing between the medieval world and the modern one. It's about borrowing the best habits from both. So, after spending the night wandering through medieval villages, muddy fields, crowded markets, and smoky cottages, we've arrived at a rather unexpected conclusion. Medieval people didn't have perfect lives, not even close. If someone offered you the chance to swap your life for theirs tomorrow morning, you would probably ask one important question first. Do I still get antibiotics? If the answer was no, the conversation would end remarkably quickly. The Middle Ages were filled with hardships that most of us would never willingly choose. Disease, famine, poor sanitation, dangerous childbirth, and limited opportunities were very real parts of everyday life. And yet, hidden beneath those hardships were habits that modern science keeps rediscovering. Live with a close community. Spend time outdoors every day. Move your body naturally. Follow regular routines. Celebrate often. Accept that not everything can be controlled. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this. Medieval people rarely expected life to be perfect. They expected it to be unpredictable. There is an enormous difference. Today, even a small inconvenience can feel like a personal disaster. The internet is slow, your coffee order is wrong, the package arrives one day late. Somehow, these tiny frustrations pile on top of one another until your brain reacts as though you're preparing to defend a castle under siege. Meanwhile, a medieval baker would probably look at your situation with genuine concern before saying, "So, everyone is alive?" Perspective changes everything. That doesn't mean your problems aren't real. Modern stress is absolutely real. Your brain responds to constant deadlines, financial uncertainty, endless notifications, and information overload in ways that our ancestors never had to experience. Chronic stress is exhausting precisely because it never seems to end. The medieval world reminds us that human beings weren't designed to live with thousands of tiny worries following them every waking hour. We were designed for seasons, for community, for meaningful work, for evenings that actually feel like evenings, for conversations uninterrupted by glowing rectangles demanding immediate attention, and perhaps, every now and then, for doing absolutely nothing at all. You don't need to move into a thatched cottage. You don't need to give away your smartphone or begin raising chickens in the garden, although your neighbours would certainly have some interesting opinions if you did. Sometimes, the smallest medieval habit can make the biggest difference. Walk instead of drive when you can. Eat with family without looking at a screen. Learn your neighbours' names. Take a day to genuinely rest instead of simply catching up on more work. Let the seasons slow you down instead of constantly trying to outrun them. History isn't only a story about how far we've come. Sometimes it's a quiet reminder of what we've left behind. And perhaps the secret to feeling a little less stressed isn't hiding in some revolutionary new invention waiting just around the corner. Perhaps it's been waiting for centuries, in the peaceful rhythm of a medieval village, patiently reminding us that a good life has never been measured by how busy we are, but by how fully we live the ordinary moments in between. Long before the first rays of sunlight climb over the mountains of Central Asia, your day has already begun. You don't wake because an alarm rings. You wake because thousands of years of experience have taught caravan leaders that the coolest hours belong to travellers. Every minute spent sleeping after dawn means another minute walking beneath a merciless afternoon sun. Whether you are crossing the Taklamakan Desert, the Iranian Plateau, or the windswept steppes near Samarkand, the rule remains the same. Leave early, or suffer later. Your eyes slowly open beneath a wool blanket, stiff with the night's chill. Desert nights have a habit of reminding you that yesterday's blazing heat was only temporary. The stars still hang overhead, brighter than anything you have probably seen in the modern world. There are no cities nearby, no electric lights, no airplanes crossing the heavens. Only silence, interrupted by the occasional grunt of a camel that clearly disagrees with the concept of mornings. Around you, the camp is little more than scattered shadows. Merchants from China sleep beside Persian traders. Sogdian interpreters curl beneath heavy cloaks. A Buddhist monk rests only a few steps from a Muslim camel driver, while somewhere beyond them, an Indian spice merchant snores with remarkable confidence for someone transporting half his life's fortune across thousands of dangerous miles. Nobody has to shout for everyone to wake. Instead, the camp slowly stirs, almost like a living creature stretching its limbs. A cough echoes through the darkness. Someone feeds another piece of dung into a dying fire, producing just enough warmth to chase away the night's cold. Leather bags rustle. Wooden bowls knock softly against one another. Somewhere a horse stamps impatiently at the frozen ground, already eager to move. You quickly learn that sleeping late is considered a luxury, reserved for people who own houses instead of camels. The caravan itself may contain anywhere from a few dozen travellers to several hundred. Larger expeditions often included hundreds of camels carrying silk, porcelain, spices, paper, precious stones, glassware, perfumes, ivory, and occasionally diplomatic gifts worth fortunes. Every animal, every crate, and every person has a place that must be maintained with military precision before departure. Chaos, after all, is surprisingly expensive. As you pull yourself upright, the cold air bites at your face. Your fingers feel numb as you fold your blanket and gather your few possessions. Unlike modern vacations, there is no suitcase waiting neatly packed beside a hotel bed. Everything you own must either fit onto your back or onto a camel that already has plenty of opinions about carrying it. For a brief moment, you look east. The horizon has begun to fade from black into deep shades of blue. Dawn is still hidden, but it is coming quickly. Soon, the caravan will become a moving river of people stretching across the landscape, following routes that have connected civilizations for centuries. But before the bells begin to ring, and the camels take their first reluctant steps, there is one more challenge waiting for every traveller. Breakfast must somehow happen before the road calls once again. As the faint blue glow on the eastern horizon grows brighter, the campsite undergoes an astonishing transformation. Only moments ago, it looked like a collection of sleeping strangers scattered across the wilderness. Now it resembles a bustling town that has somehow sprung from the earth overnight. There are no stone walls, no permanent buildings, and no market square. Yet every person seems to know exactly where to go and what to do. The Silk Road rewards organisation. It has very little patience for confusion. You quickly discover that nobody wastes words this early. The caravan leader walks through the camp carrying a simple staff, quietly checking that everyone is awake. He doesn't need to bark orders. His authority comes from experience. He knows where the next reliable well is located. He knows which mountain pass is safest this season. Most importantly, he knows that a single poor decision can leave hundreds of people stranded in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Around him, dozens of small fires flicker back to life. Travellers warm their hands while carefully conserving every scrap of fuel. In many parts of Central Asia, firewood is almost non-existent. Instead, dried camel or horse dung serves as the morning's fuel. It may not smell like your favourite scented candle, but it burns surprisingly well. You decide not to complain. Everyone else seems perfectly satisfied, and besides, nobody has invented online reviews for campsites yet. Nearby, merchants begin inspecting yesterday's cargo. rolls of Chinese silk remain tightly wrapped inside waterproof coverings. Sacks filled with pepper, cinnamon, cloves and saffron are checked for moisture. Delicate porcelain is examined for cracks after another night of swaying on camel backs. A damaged crate could erase months of profit before the journey is even halfway finished. The languages surrounding you are as varied as the merchandise. You hear Persian spoken beside Sogdian, Turkic dialects mixing with Chinese, Arabic, Sanskrit, and occasionally Greek. Few people understand every conversation, which explains why interpreters are some of the most valuable members of the expedition. Along the Silk Road, speaking several languages can earn you almost as much respect as carrying a sword. Meanwhile, the animals begin announcing that they, too, are awake. Camels groan dramatically, as if personally offended by the arrival of another morning. Horses snort into the cold air. Donkeys bray without warning. Bells hanging from harnesses produce a gentle chorus that echoes across the empty landscape. It is noisy enough to wake anyone still sleeping, though anyone still asleep at this point is unlikely to remain popular for long. Within less than an hour, the peaceful campsite has become a perfectly coordinated machine. Every movement serves a purpose, every minute has value, and every traveller understands the same simple truth. The road is waiting, and it never waits forever. With the camp now fully awake, your stomach begins reminding you that yesterday's dinner disappeared many hours ago. Breakfast is not a leisurely affair. Nobody unfolds elegant tables or debates whether to have sweet or savoury options. The Silk Road is many things: a highway of commerce, a meeting place of civilizations, a bridge between East and West, but it is certainly not an all-inclusive resort. The meal must be quick, nourishing, and easy to carry. Depending on where your caravan is travelling, breakfast looks surprisingly different. A merchant from northern China unwraps steamed wheat buns he prepared the evening before. A Persian trader tears pieces from a flat loaf of bread, dipping them into soft cheese made from sheep's milk. An Indian traveller nibbles dried fruit mixed with nuts, while Turkic nomads pass around fermented dairy products that are rich in calories and surprisingly filling. You decide to try everything. This seems like an excellent cultural experience until someone offers you a bowl of fermented camel's milk. It is memorable. Let's simply say that if modern coffee wakes you up with caffeine, fermented camel's milk achieves a similar result through sheer surprise. Bread remains the foundation of nearly every breakfast. Flatbreads can survive days inside leather bags without spoiling, making them ideal companions for long journeys. They are often eaten alongside dates, raisins, figs, almonds, walnuts or pistachios, foods packed with energy, yet light enough to transport across continents. Fresh fruit is a rare luxury, unless the caravan happens to be near fertile valleys or bustling cities. Meat appears occasionally, usually as dried or salted strips prepared weeks earlier. Freshly cooked meat before sunrise would be considered an unnecessary delay, and delays have an unfortunate habit of turning into disasters once the afternoon heat arrives. Water, meanwhile, is treated with almost sacred respect. Nobody pours generous cups simply because they feel thirsty. Every sip is measured. Caravan leaders know exactly how much water remains in each skin and how many days separate the expedition from the next reliable spring or caravanserai. Waste today may become desperation tomorrow. Tea is becoming increasingly common across many sections of the Silk Road, particularly farther east. Chinese merchants often carry compressed tea bricks, which can be broken apart and brewed over the morning fire. In Western regions, herbal infusions are more familiar, flavoured with local plants gathered during previous stops. As you finish eating, nobody lingers beside the fire. Bowls are cleaned immediately. Leftovers disappear into travel bags. Every crumb has value. Every minute counts. Around you, breakfast ends almost as quickly as it began, replaced by a far more demanding task. Hundreds of camels are waiting to be loaded, and not one of them has volunteered to make the job easy. Breakfast is over, but the hardest work of the morning has only just begun. You turn toward the long line of camels, and suddenly understand why experienced Silk Road merchants respected these animals while simultaneously questioning every life choice that had brought them here. The camels are sitting quietly for the moment, legs folded beneath them like enormous ships resting in harbour. They appear peaceful enough, chewing thoughtfully as though contemplating philosophy. Do not be fooled. The instant someone starts fastening cargo onto their backs, many reveal personalities that range from mildly stubborn to deeply offended. A loud groan rolls across the camp. Another camel answers. Within seconds, it sounds as though the entire caravan has formed a committee dedicated to complaining about mornings. Unlike horses, which carried riders into battle, the Bactrian camel was built for endurance. With its two humps storing fat reserves rather than water, it could travel for days across deserts and freezing mountain passes, while carrying loads that often exceeded 400 pounds. Thick fur protected it from bitter winter winds in Central Asia, while broad, padded feet spread its weight across loose sand, making it one of the greatest transportation innovations long before anyone imagined the wheel on an 18-wheeler. Every load must be carefully balanced. A crate of Chinese porcelain cannot simply be thrown onto one side, while sacks of pepper hang from the other. If the weight is uneven, the animal becomes uncomfortable, stumbles more easily, and may even throw off its cargo during the journey. A single broken chest of porcelain or shattered glassware could represent the profits of an entire year. Experienced camel handlers know exactly where everything belongs. Heavy goods sit low against the animal's sides. Fragile merchandise is wrapped in layers of felt, leather, straw, or woven cloth to cushion every step. Silk is protected from moisture. Spices are sealed against dust. Precious stones, coins, and official documents are usually kept much closer to their owners than anyone else realizes. A wise merchant never advertises exactly where his fortune is hidden. The loading process follows a surprisingly strict order. First come the trade goods. Then tents, cooking equipment, tools, spare harnesses, water skins, and food supplies. Finally, personal belongings are squeezed into whatever space remains. If you packed an unnecessary luxury, this is the moment you regret it. That extra blanket suddenly seems less essential when your camel looks at you with the expression of an overworked employee contemplating resignation. Not every camel carries merchandise. Some transport elderly travellers or children. Others carry scribes responsible for recording transactions, physicians with herbs and medicines, or armed guards whose weapons remain within easy reach. Larger caravans often include blacksmiths capable of repairing broken metal fittings, veterinarians who understand animal care, and cooks responsible for feeding dozens or even hundreds of people each evening. The camp slowly empties as each loaded camel rises to its feet. Watching one stand is an event in itself. First, the hind legs straighten, pitching you alarmingly forward. Then the front legs unfold, throwing you backward with equal enthusiasm. If you happen to be sitting on top before the animal finishes standing, congratulations. You have just experienced the Silk Road's version of an amusement park ride. At last, the endless line of camels stretches toward the horizon, each carrying a small piece of the world's wealth. Now all that remains is preparing yourself to survive the day ahead. With the camels loaded and the caravan nearly ready to depart, you take one final look at yourself. Not because you're hoping to impress anyone. After all, the only audience likely to judge your appearance is a camel that has already expressed its disappointment several times this morning. No, your clothing has a far more important purpose than fashion. Along the Silk Road, what you wear can determine whether you arrive safely at the next city, or become another cautionary tale told around evening campfires. You begin with your innermost layer, usually a simple linen or cotton tunic. These fabrics absorb sweat and help keep your skin comfortable during the long hours ahead. Wealthier merchants might wear softer, finely woven cloth imported from distant regions, while ordinary caravan workers settle for rougher fabrics that prioritize durability over elegance. Nobody is handing out awards for best dressed traveller in the middle of the Gobi Desert. Over the tunic comes a heavier robe made from wool or thick woven cloth. At first, wrapping yourself in layers before walking beneath the blazing sun seems completely backwards. Surely less clothing means less heat. Not quite. Loose robes create pockets of air that slow the sun's relentless assault, while shielding your skin from ultraviolet rays, blowing sand, and biting winds. Across the deserts of Asia, covering yourself is often cooler than exposing yourself. It is one of those lessons travellers learn quickly or painfully. Around your waist, you tighten a broad leather belt. This is far more than something preventing your robe from falling dramatically at the worst possible moment. The belt carries your daily essentials: a small knife for cutting food or repairing ropes, a leather pouch containing coins from several different kingdoms, a flint striker for making fire, perhaps a wooden spoon, and occasionally a small personal charm believed to bring good fortune. Superstition travels just as efficiently as silk. Your feet deserve particular attention. Modern hiking boots would certainly make life easier, but they are still many centuries away. Instead, you wear sturdy leather boots or thick sandals depending on the region and season. The soles are reinforced against sharp rocks and thorny plants, while strips of cloth wrapped around the feet help reduce blisters. Because once a blister becomes infected several hundred miles from the nearest physician, your travel itinerary suddenly becomes much less flexible. Finally comes the head covering. Whether it is a felt cap, a wrapped turban, or a fur-lined hat in colder climates, protecting your head is essential. The same route that freezes before sunrise may become unbearably hot by midday. Travellers often adjust their head coverings throughout the day, loosening cloth to allow airflow or wrapping it tightly when desert winds begin throwing sand into every available opening, including ones you were previously unaware existed. As you finish dressing, you glance around the caravan. Chinese merchants wear long robes fastened neatly across the chest. Persian traders favour flowing garments with colourful belts. Turkic horsemen dress in practical riding coats, while Tibetan travellers prepare for mountain cold with heavy wool and fur. Despite their differences, they all share the same understanding. Out here, clothing is not a statement of style. It is a piece of survival equipment, every bit as important as the water skin hanging from your saddle, or the camel patiently waiting to carry you toward another uncertain day across Asia. The caravan is almost ready to leave, yet one final pause settles over the camp. It isn't caused by forgotten cargo or an escaped camel. Instead, hundreds of travellers take a few quiet moments for themselves before another day on the road begins. Although they all share the same destination for today, they have arrived from vastly different corners of Asia, bringing with them their own beliefs, customs, and mourning rituals. Standing in the middle of the camp is like watching the entire continent wake up at once. A few paces away, a Muslim merchant unrolls a small prayer rug on a patch of level ground. Facing west toward Mecca, he quietly performs the dawn prayer, one of the 5 daily prayers that shape his life, whether he is in Baghdad, Bukhara, or somewhere between endless dunes. His companions respectfully avoid walking in front of him. Trade may be important, but faith keeps its place in the morning schedule. Nearby, a Buddhist monk sits cross-legged with remarkable stillness. His possessions could fit inside a single bundle, yet his calm presence somehow fills more space than the heavily loaded wagons beside him. He softly recites verses while turning a string of prayer beads through his fingers, preparing his mind before preparing his feet. Across the camp, a Nestorian Christian from Mesopotamia quietly traces the sign of the cross before eating the last piece of flatbread from his breakfast. Not far away, a Zoroastrian trader from Persia faces the growing light in silent reflection, offering prayers associated with truth and the sacred order of the world. The rising sun reminds him of divine light, though he does not worship the sun itself, as outsiders sometimes mistakenly believed. Chinese merchants begin their morning differently. Some burn a pinch of fragrant incense before a small travel shrine dedicated to their ancestors or to protective deities believed to watch over merchants. Others simply bow respectfully toward a wooden tablet tucked carefully inside their luggage. Along the Silk Road, family remained close, even when home was thousands of miles away. Then there are the practical rituals. Camel drivers inspect their animals' hooves one last time. Horsemen tighten saddle straps. Caravan guards sharpen sword edges with smooth whetstones while checking bowstrings for signs of wear. Physicians sort through bundles of dried herbs, making sure precious medicines remain dry after the cold night. Even experienced cooks quietly count flour, salt, and dried fruit before the supplies disappear beneath layers of cargo. You begin developing your own morning ritual. First, you stretch your aching shoulders. Sleeping on the ground has introduced muscles you never realized existed. Then you double-check your water skin, adjust your belt, and count your belongings for what feels like the 10th time. Nothing has gone missing, but everyone else keeps checking, so you decide that paranoia is probably part of the local culture. Nobody laughs at these habits. Experience has taught every traveller that small routines prevent large disasters. A loose strap discovered now is far better than discovering it after a chest of porcelain crashes onto a rocky mountain trail. As the first golden rays finally spill across the landscape, the camp grows quiet once more. The rituals are finished. The road is calling again. The sun has finally climbed above the horizon, painting the mountains in shades of gold, but nobody gives the order to depart just yet. A successful Silk Road caravan never simply picked a direction and hoped for the best. Hope, while comforting, had a terrible reputation for getting people lost. Instead, the caravan leader gathers his senior merchants, scouts, camel masters, and armed guards for one final discussion before the day's journey begins. It is less like a grand military council, and more like an experienced group of people comparing every piece of information they have collected over the past several days. One scout reports that the river crossing ahead is still passable after last week's rain. Another warns that a section of mountain trail has partially collapsed, forcing caravans to take a longer route through a nearby valley. The extra distance is inconvenient, but considerably preferable to watching several hundred camels discover the meaning of gravity all at once. News travels surprisingly fast along the Silk Road. Every caravanserai, every market, every isolated village becomes an information exchange. Merchants rarely arrive carrying only goods. They also bring stories. They know which rulers have increased taxes, where new wells have been dug, which bridges have washed away, and whether bandits have recently appeared along particular stretches of road. Some of those stories are completely reliable. Others become slightly more dramatic every time they are told. By the 5th retelling, 3 suspicious horsemen somehow become an army capable of conquering half of Asia. Learning which rumours deserve attention is almost as valuable as reading a map. Maps themselves exist, but they are often incomplete. Most are hand-drawn and represent only portions of the vast network stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Even the finest maps cannot tell you whether yesterday's sandstorm buried a familiar landmark, or whether spring floods have turned a peaceful stream into a dangerous torrent. That knowledge belongs to the people who travel the road. The caravan leader studies the sky almost as carefully as the landscape. High, thin clouds drifting from the west may signal changing weather. Strong morning winds could mean an afternoon dust storm is approaching. Experienced travellers notice details that newcomers overlook entirely: the behaviour of birds, the direction of smoke from distant camps, even the smell carried on the breeze. You attempt to contribute by confidently pointing toward what you believe is the correct direction. Unfortunately, you are pointing directly at a particularly impressive-looking rock. The caravan leader politely ignores your navigational expertise. Security is the final concern. The guards inspect their spears, bows, and curved swords one last time. They are not expecting a battle every morning, but they understand that valuable cargo attracts unwanted attention. Silk, spices, silver, and precious stones are irresistible prizes for thieves willing to risk an attack. Most caravans avoid trouble through careful planning rather than heroic fighting. A larger caravan, a safer route, or an earlier departure often prevents conflict before it begins. At last the leader gives a single nod. The scouts move to the front. The guards spread along the flanks. The merchants take their places beside their animals. Everything has been checked. Everything that can be predicted has been predicted. Now comes the part no amount of preparation can ever fully control: the journey itself. The order to depart is never shouted. It doesn't need to be. One by one, the camel drivers give quiet commands, tug gently on lead ropes, and the enormous animals begin rising from the ground. First, their hind legs straighten, pitching the cargo forward, then their front legs unfold, throwing everything backward. If you happen to be riding when this happens for the first time, you discover that surviving the journey begins with surviving the camel's version of standing up. All around you, the camp comes undone. The cooking fires are smothered with sand until not even a glowing ember remains. Nobody wants to leave behind evidence for thieves, or accidentally start a grass fire in the dry plains. Tent poles disappear into bundles, blankets are tied securely onto packs, and within minutes there is almost no sign that several hundred people spent the night here. Long before the castle opens its gates, before the kitchens fill with the smell of fresh bread, and before the lord even stirs beneath his wool blankets, the fortress is already awake. Not everyone, of course. The lucky people are still asleep. You are not one of them. The final watch of the night has always been considered the longest. Standing atop the curtain wall in the hours before dawn, you stamp your feet against the cold stone to keep the feeling in your toes. Medieval castles are magnificent to look at from a distance, but they have an unfortunate habit of letting winter winds explore every crack and corner. Even in summer, the hours before sunrise can be surprisingly chilly. The world beyond the walls is almost completely silent. A faint mist hangs over the nearby fields. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl finishes its nightly hunt while a fox disappears into the undergrowth. The village below the castle still sleeps, its cottages nothing more than dark outlines beneath a blanket of stars. There are no glowing streetlights, no distant hum of traffic, no comforting buzz of electricity, only the occasional crackle of a dying torch and the sound of the wind brushing against the battlements. You pause beside one of the towers and peer into the darkness. Every few minutes your eyes scan the roads leading toward the castle. Merchants sometimes arrive before sunrise, hoping for an early start. Messengers carrying urgent news often travel through the night. Less welcome visitors, bandits, raiders, or enemy scouts also prefer darkness. Fortunately, tonight the roads remain empty. Still, the watch cannot relax. A medieval castle survives because someone is always paying attention. Down in the courtyard, only a handful of lanterns still burn. Most of yesterday's fires have faded into glowing embers. The great hall is quiet, the stables peaceful except for the occasional snort from a horse dreaming of greener pastures, or perhaps simply dreaming of not carrying armoured knights all day. Frankly, the horse has a reasonable point. The castle itself seems almost asleep. Yet appearances can be deceiving. Inside the gatehouse, the night guards quietly exchange information with the men who will soon replace them. In the chapel, an elderly priest has already risen for his morning prayers. Somewhere in the kitchens, one of the senior cooks is beginning to stir, knowing that feeding more than 100 people cannot be accomplished in the last 10 minutes before breakfast. Life inside a castle never truly stops. Even while nobles sleep beneath heavy feather beds, dozens of servants continue working through the darkness. Stable boys check valuable horses. Bakers prepare dough before the ovens are lit. The castle physician may spend the night tending a sick servant or treating a wounded soldier who arrived after sunset. Every hour belongs to someone. As the eastern horizon slowly changes from black to deep blue, the first rays of dawn begin creeping across the countryside. The longest shift of the night is nearly over. For the castle, however, the real work is only just about to begin. As the first pale light spreads across the sky, the castle's quiet stillness begins to disappear. The changing of the watch is underway. The guards who have spent the entire night patrolling the battlements finally make their way toward the gatehouse. Their faces are tired, their cloaks damp with morning dew, and they are already thinking about a warm meal and a few precious hours of sleep. Coming the other way are fresh guards, adjusting helmets, fastening belts, and taking their places without ceremony. Every shift begins with the same exchange. Anything unusual? If the answer is nothing, everyone breathes a little easier. If the answer is anything else, the morning suddenly becomes much more interesting. The gatehouse is easily the busiest building in the castle this early in the day. It is far more than a pair of wooden doors. It is a fortress within the fortress, built to protect the weakest point in the walls. Massive oak gates reinforced with iron stand several inches thick, while above them waits the portcullis, a heavy iron lattice that can crash down in seconds if danger appears. Murder holes line the ceiling above the entrance, allowing defenders to attack anyone foolish enough to fight their way inside. It is a welcoming sight, provided you are arriving peacefully. The captain of the guard begins his inspection. He checks that the locking beams are undamaged after another night. The hinges are examined for cracks. The chains supporting the drawbridge are inspected, and every mechanism is tested before anyone touches the controls. A broken chain at the wrong moment could turn an ordinary morning into an extremely memorable lesson in medieval engineering. Meanwhile, outside the walls, people are already waiting. Several farmers have arrived with carts loaded with vegetables, eggs, butter, and freshly churned cheese. A fisherman carries baskets packed with the night's catch from a nearby river. Two merchants wait patiently beside heavily loaded mules, hoping to sell cloth, salt, or imported wine to the castle household. Everyone knows the gates will not open simply because they have arrived early. Security comes before commerce. One by one, the visitors are recognized by the guards. Familiar faces receive a nod. Strangers receive questions. Where are you from? Who are you here to see? What are you carrying? There are no passports or identity cards. Instead, trust is built through reputation. A merchant who has supplied the castle for 20 years is greeted very differently from a traveller no one has seen before. Suspicion is not considered rude, it is considered survival. Finally, the order is given. Several guards grasp thick wooden handles connected to the winching mechanism. Slowly, the massive portcullis rises with a deep metallic rattle that echoes across the courtyard. At the same time, other men push against the enormous gates. They swing outward with a long, groaning creak, their iron hinges complaining after another damp night. For the first time since sunset, the castle opens itself to the outside world. Almost immediately, the quiet courtyard begins to fill with life. Farmers lead their carts across the drawbridge. Messengers hurry inside carrying sealed letters. Stable boys guide wagons toward the storehouses, while guards continue watching every newcomer with practiced eyes. The castle is no longer asleep. Its heart has begun to beat, and the next task waiting for hundreds of people is warming the fortress itself before the morning truly begins. With the gates now standing open and the first visitors entering the courtyard, another transformation begins inside the castle walls. The fortress must be brought back to life, not with magic, with fire. Throughout the night, most of the castle's great hearths have been allowed to die down, leaving only glowing embers buried beneath layers of ash. Firewood is valuable, and no sensible steward would waste it by keeping enormous fires roaring while everyone slept. Instead, the servants rely on yesterday's coals to create today's warmth. It is a race against the cold. In the kitchens, the first servants are already hard at work. They kneel beside the great hearth, carefully brushing away the ash until tiny orange sparks appear. Dry straw is laid over the embers, followed by thin twigs collected the previous day. One servant bends low and blows gently. Nothing happens. He blows again. A tiny flame flickers. Another handful of kindling is added, then another, until suddenly the fire catches with a satisfying crackle. Within minutes, thick oak logs are pushed into the growing blaze, and the massive fireplace begins warming the largest room in the castle. One fire is never enough. Large castles often contain dozens of hearths scattered throughout the kitchens, great hall, private chambers, workshops, guard rooms, and even some towers. Every one of them must be relit. Servants hurry through dark corridors carrying glowing coals in iron braziers, using them to awaken fireplaces that have slept through the night. It is surprisingly dangerous work. A dropped coal can set straw flooring ablaze. A neglected chimney can fill a chamber with deadly smoke. Medieval castles were built largely of stone, but their floors, furniture, roofs, tapestries and beams contained plenty of wood. Fire was both the castle's greatest servant and one of its greatest enemies. Soon the kitchens become almost unrecognisable. The cold silence is replaced by the sound of crackling logs, clanging iron pots, and the scraping of heavy cauldrons across stone hearths. Sparks dance upward into blackened chimneys that have witnessed generations of cooks preparing meals for nobles, soldiers, and servants alike. The smell changes as well. First comes wood smoke, filling the air with the familiar scent of burning oak and beech. Then fresh bread begins baking inside enormous ovens that were heated long before dawn. Porridge simmers in great iron pots. Bacon sizzles over open flames, while onions and herbs release aromas that slowly drift through the corridors. If you are sleeping in one of the upper chambers, this is probably when you wake up. Not because someone politely announces breakfast, because an entire castle has suddenly become wonderfully noisy. Elsewhere, maids carry candles and small oil lamps through the darker rooms, replacing those that burned out overnight. Although daylight is spreading outside, Thick stone walls and narrow windows leave many interiors surprisingly dim. Light remains just as important as heat. By the time the sun rises fully above the battlements, warmth is beginning to spread through the fortress. The castle no longer feels like a cold stone shell. It feels like a home. And now that the fires are burning, it is finally time for the people who live here, from the highest noble to the youngest stable boy, to begin their own morning routines. With the fires burning and the kitchens filling the castle with the smell of fresh bread, the fortress begins to wake room by room. Not everyone wakes at the same time, and certainly not everyone wakes the same way. In the Lord's private chamber, thick curtains allow only thin strips of morning light to creep through the narrow windows. The room is one of the warmest in the castle, thanks to its large fireplace and heavy tapestries hanging along the stone walls. Even so, the air remains cool enough that nobody is eager to leave the comfort of the bed. The Lord's day rarely begins alone. A valet quietly enters the chamber carrying freshly heated water in bronze basins. Another servant lays out the day's clothing, a linen shirt, woolen hose, a finely woven tunic, leather belt, and perhaps a fur-lined cloak if winter has settled over the countryside. Wealthy nobles owned dozens of garments, but dressing still required assistance. Buttons were scarce, layers were numerous, and expensive fabrics deserved careful handling. There is no rushing. A medieval noble's appearance is a statement of authority. Meanwhile, in the ladies' chambers, the morning follows a similar rhythm. Her attendants help brush and braid her hair, arrange her gown, and prepare jewellery appropriate for the day's responsibilities. Contrary to popular imagination, noble women often had busy schedules. They supervised servants, managed household supplies, oversaw textile production, received guests, organised charitable work, and sometimes even handled estate business while their husbands travelled or fought in distant campaigns. Elsewhere in the castle, life is considerably less elegant. The squires have already been awake for some time. Young boys training to become knights quickly discover that sleeping late is an excellent way to become acquainted with extra chores. They dress in simple wool clothing before hurrying toward the armoury or stables, where experienced knights expect armour to be polished, horses to be groomed, and equipment to be inspected before breakfast. The stable yard is already alive with activity. Grooms brush horses until their coats shine despite yesterday's dust. Hooves are cleaned carefully, harnesses examined for wear, and fresh hay distributed to animals that seem permanently convinced they have not eaten in several weeks. A war horse represents an enormous investment, often costing more than an ordinary farmer could earn in years. Neglecting one would be like forgetting where you parked a luxury sports car, except the sports car occasionally bites. In the servants' quarters, there is no luxury of slow mornings. Maids hurry through corridors carrying clean linens. Laundry workers haul heavy baskets toward washing areas. Pages race between chambers delivering messages from senior officials already planning the day's business. The steward has likely been awake since before dawn, checking inventories of grain, ale, salted meat, candles, and firewood. Running a castle requires constant accounting because feeding 200 people every day has an unfortunate habit of emptying storehouses. Even the castle chapel begins to fill. Some residents pause briefly for morning prayers before beginning their duties, while the priest prepares for the day's first service. Faith touches nearly every aspect of castle life, weaving itself into routines as naturally as lighting the hearths or opening the gates. Within an hour, nearly every chamber echoes with footsteps, conversation, and purposeful movement. The household is fully awake. Now comes perhaps the most important challenge of every medieval morning: feeding everyone before the real work of the day begins. As the castle reaches full wakefulness, one unmistakable sound begins to dominate the morning: growling stomachs. From the lord in his private chamber to the stable boy covered in straw, everyone expects breakfast. The problem is that feeding a castle is nothing like preparing a family meal. It is more like supplying a small village every single day, without supermarkets, refrigerators, or food deliveries arriving exactly at 9 o'clock. Fortunately, medieval kitchens are already several hours ahead. The Great Kitchen is one of the busiest rooms in the entire fortress. Massive fireplaces roar with fresh logs, while enormous iron cauldrons bubble over open flames. Cooks move quickly between ovens, chopping tables and storage rooms, each person knowing their task so well that very few words are needed. The morning routine has been repeated thousands of times. One mistake, however, can ruin breakfast for hundreds. The master cook oversees everything like a battlefield commander. He checks the bread baking inside the stone ovens, tastes the porridge simmering in great pots, and makes sure the day's meat has been properly prepared. Although nobles often enjoyed elaborate feasts, breakfast was usually a practical affair designed to prepare everyone for long hours of work. Bread forms the foundation of nearly every meal. Servants carry baskets filled with fresh loaves baked from wheat, rye, barley, or oats, depending on the region and the household's wealth. Wealthier families eat fine white bread made from carefully sifted flour, while servants and labourers receive darker, coarser loaves containing more bran. Both fill the stomach, though one certainly earns more compliments from the diners. Large pots of oat or barley porridge are ladled into wooden bowls. It may not look particularly exciting, but it provides steady energy throughout the morning. Honey sweetens it when available. Dried fruit is added on fortunate days. Most mornings, however, the porridge remains reassuringly simple. Nobody expects gourmet cuisine before sunrise, especially when there are walls to patrol and fields to manage. Ale accompanies breakfast more often than water. That surprises many people today, but medieval small ale contains very little alcohol and is generally safer to drink than untreated water drawn from uncertain sources. Children drink it. Servants drink it. Even the lord's table usually includes it alongside watered wine or fresh milk when available. Meanwhile, the hierarchy of the castle becomes obvious. In the great hall, long wooden tables are arranged according to status. The lord, his family, honoured guests, and senior knights sit upon the raised dais overlooking everyone else. Below them gather officials, squires, household officers, and trusted retainers. Servants usually eat separately in the kitchen or service rooms, often finishing their own breakfast quickly before returning to work. Not every breakfast is peaceful. Dogs wander hopefully beneath the tables, searching for dropped scraps. A page accidentally spills a jug of ale and earns an immediate glare from the steward. One knight discovers that his favourite loaf has mysteriously disappeared, only to notice another knight chewing suspiciously nearby. Medieval castles may have been centres of power, but they were not immune to the occasional breakfast theft. Within half an hour, bowls begin emptying. The bread baskets grow lighter. Conversations become shorter. Breakfast is over, and nobody lingers for long. An entire castle is waiting to be managed, repaired, defended, cleaned, and governed. The meal has provided the fuel. Now the day's real work can finally begin. With breakfast finished and the last wooden bowls carried back to the kitchens, the castle enters its busiest hour. This is when talking gives way to doing. A medieval castle cannot simply hope that everything will somehow run itself until sunset. Hundreds of people live and work within its walls, and every one of them has a responsibility. If even a few fail to do their jobs, the entire household begins to feel the consequences. Food spoils, repairs are delayed, horses go unfed, supplies disappear. Before long, the steward has a headache powerful enough to rival a battering ram, which is why every morning begins with organisation. At the centre of it all stands the steward. If the lord owns the castle, the steward keeps it functioning. He oversees nearly every aspect of the household, from food stores to finances, servants to supplies. Before most people have even finished breakfast, he is already reviewing reports delivered by scribes and senior servants. How much grain remains? Did the blacksmith receive enough charcoal? How many barrels of ale are left in the cellar? Has the mill delivered this week's flour? These questions may sound terribly dull. They also determine whether everyone eats next month. Nearby, scribes unroll parchment across heavy oak tables. Goose feather quills scratch steadily as they record rents collected from nearby villages, expenses for repairs, deliveries from merchants, and payments owed to craftsmen. Literacy is a specialised skill, and those who possess it are invaluable. While knights protect the castle with swords, scribes protect it with careful bookkeeping. Outside in the courtyard, the day's assignments begin. The master mason gathers several labourers to repair loose stones along the outer wall, where winter frost has opened small cracks. A carpenter receives instructions to replace a damaged stable door before one particularly adventurous horse decides. Freedom sounds appealing. Roofers climb ladders carrying bundles of wooden shingles, hoping to finish repairs before the next rainfall reminds everyone why maintenance matters. In another corner of the castle, the blacksmith's forge roars back to life. The rhythmic ringing of hammer against hot iron echoes across the courtyard. Horses need fresh shoes. Hinges require repair. Broken knives must be sharpened. Armour occasionally arrives dented after tournaments or skirmishes, looking rather less heroic than its owner remembers. The armourer has seen worse. Much worse. Beyond the workshops, servants disperse in every direction. Some sweep the great hall before important visitors arrive. Others scrub floors, wash laundry, refill candles, or carry fresh rushes to replace those covering the stone floors. The castle may appear grand from the outside, but without constant cleaning, it would quickly become far less impressive and considerably smellier. The steward also meets with the reeve, the official responsible for overseeing the surrounding estate. Together, they discuss today's work beyond the walls. Farmers must plough fields, shepherds move their flocks, woodcutters gather timber, and foresters inspect hunting grounds belonging to the lord. The castle depends entirely upon the countryside around it. Without the villages, forests, mills, and farms, even the strongest fortress would soon run out of food. Within an hour, every corner of the castle hums with activity. Orders have been given. Tools are in motion. Repairs have begun. The fortress now operates like an enormous machine, each person serving as one essential gear. But while hundreds labour to keep daily life running smoothly, another group has a very different responsibility. Their job is making sure the castle remains ready for war, even on the most ordinary morning. While the carpenters repair doors, the cooks prepare lunch, and the steward manages the day's endless responsibilities, another part of the castle follows a routine that can never be skipped. The defences must be checked. A peaceful morning means very little to the captain of the guard. His job is to prepare for mornings that are not peaceful. The changing of the guard continues across the battlements, as fresh soldiers replace the men who stood watch through the night. They exchange brief reports before taking their positions along the curtain walls, gatehouse, towers and corners, where the surrounding countryside can be observed for miles. The questions are always the same. Did anyone approach during the night? Were any fires seen in the distance? Has anyone reported suspicious travellers? Most mornings the answers are reassuringly boring, and boring is exactly what every castle commander hopes to hear. The captain begins his inspection at the gatehouse, the strongest and most heavily defended section of the fortress. He examines the great oak gates that were opened earlier, making sure they can still be closed quickly if danger appears. The portcullis is raised and lowered once more to ensure its chains move freely. A rusted mechanism or broken rope discovered during an attack could prove catastrophic. Next come the walls. Walking along the battlements, the captain carefully studies every section of stonework. Winter frost, heavy rain, and years of weather slowly weaken even the thickest walls. Small cracks are marked for the masons to repair before they become larger problems. Loose stones are removed and replaced. Every weakness is corrected while there is still time. Because enemies rarely announce their arrival weeks in advance. Archers, meanwhile, inspect their equipment. Longbows are unstrung overnight to preserve their strength, so each bow is carefully restrung and tested. Bowstrings made from hemp, flax, or animal sinew are examined for fraying. Arrows are counted one by one, damaged shafts discarded, and fresh bundles carried to storage racks along the walls. Crossbows receive even more attention. Their steel or wooden prods are checked for cracks, the winding mechanisms are lubricated, and bolts are inspected to ensure their iron heads remain firmly attached. A crossbow that fails during battle becomes little more than an awkwardly shaped club. Inside the armoury, rows of helmets, shields, spears, swords, axes, and polearms wait in neat order. If you had been invited to dine with Napoleon Bonaparte, you might have imagined one of history's greatest rulers enjoying long, elegant dinners, surrounded by glittering silver, fine wines, and endless conversation. You would have been disappointed. Not because the food was poor, because the meal would probably be over before you had finished your soup. For Napoleon, eating was rarely a pleasure. It was a necessity, another task squeezed between military reports, political meetings, diplomatic negotiations, and planning campaigns that reshaped Europe. While aristocrats of his age often lingered around the table for 2 or 3 hours, discussing philosophy, gossip, and the latest fashions, the Emperor of the French frequently finished his meal in barely 10 or 15 minutes. His servants struggled to keep up. One moment they were placing the first course on the table. The next, Napoleon had already swallowed most of it and was asking for the next dish. By the time everyone else had properly unfolded their napkins, he was often standing up, announcing that work could not wait. You almost wonder why they bothered setting the table at all. Napoleon's unusual relationship with food had deep roots. Born on the island of Corsica in 1769, he grew up in a household that was respectable, but far from extravagantly wealthy. His childhood meals were simple, influenced by both Italian and French traditions. Bread, vegetables, soups, roasted meats, chestnuts, and local cheeses were common fare. There was little room for luxury, and meals were meant to nourish rather than entertain. That practical attitude never truly left him. Even after crowning himself emperor in 1804, Napoleon retained many surprisingly modest habits. While he certainly had access to the finest chefs in Europe, he rarely behaved like someone determined to enjoy their masterpieces. To him, a meal was fuel, much like oats were fuel for his cavalry horses. The horse, admittedly, probably spent more time chewing. His staff quickly learned to adapt. The imperial kitchen had to be ready at unpredictable hours, because Napoleon's schedule changed constantly. Sometimes he requested dinner early in the evening. Other times, he forgot to eat until late at night, after spending hours reviewing troop movements or dictating letters to exhausted secretaries. His cooks were expected to have fresh meals available with very little warning, knowing there was a good chance the emperor would consume them at astonishing speed. His physicians occasionally worried about this habit. Eating too quickly often left Napoleon suffering from indigestion, stomach discomfort, and bouts of acid reflux, problems that seemed to worsen as he grew older. Friends and attendants urged him to slow down, chew properly, and allow himself a few moments of relaxation. Their advice achieved approximately the same success as trying to convince a cannonball to travel more slowly. Napoleon simply believed that every minute spent lingering over dinner was a minute stolen from governing an empire. So before you picture glittering imperial banquets and leisurely conversations beneath crystal chandeliers, imagine instead a man who viewed the dinner table much like another battlefield. The objective was clear. Finish quickly, move on. There was always another campaign waiting. If Napoleon's dinners were famously brief, his breakfasts were even less of an event. By the time most members of the imperial court were beginning to stir beneath silk blankets, the emperor had often been awake for hours. Napoleon preferred rising early, especially when military matters or affairs of state demanded his attention. Secretaries, ministers, and aides-de-camp quickly learned that the day could begin almost immediately after sunrise, and anyone arriving late risked discovering that the emperor had already completed several hours of work. His breakfast reflected the same attitude. Simple, efficient. Forget towering stacks of pastries or lavish buffets stretching across marble halls. Napoleon's morning meal was usually modest, often consisting of a cup of coffee, sometimes mixed with milk, accompanied by bread or toast. On other mornings he preferred hot chocolate, a fashionable drink among Europe's elite, though even then he rarely lingered to savour it. For Napoleon, breakfast existed for one purpose, to get him back to work. The setting, however, was anything but ordinary. Inside the Tuileries Palace in Paris, servants quietly prepared the emperor's apartments before dawn. Fires were lit to warm the rooms during colder months. Fresh linens were arranged, documents stacked neatly upon writing desks, and breakfast prepared in adjoining service rooms. Every detail followed a carefully rehearsed routine, because no one could predict exactly when Napoleon would decide he was hungry, or how long that feeling would last. The palace itself buzzed with controlled urgency. Messengers arrived carrying dispatches from distant provinces. Officers delivered reports from army headquarters. Ministers waited nervously in nearby chambers, hoping for a brief audience before the emperor's schedule became impossibly crowded. While cooks carried trays through polished corridors, clerks hurried in the opposite direction with maps, letters, and official decrees awaiting Napoleon's signature. Breakfast often happened in the middle of all this activity. It was not unusual for Napoleon to continue reading reports while eating. Secretaries sometimes remained nearby, ready to write down instructions between mouthfuls of bread and coffee. One moment, he might be discussing taxation in northern Italy. The next, he would ask about naval construction or dictate a reply to an ambassador in Vienna. Multitasking, it turns out, was not invented by modern office workers. It simply involved considerably more uniforms. Napoleon's valet, Louis-Joseph Marchand, who later served him faithfully during his exile, observed that the emperor often paid remarkably little attention to what was placed before him. If the food was warm and arrived promptly, he was generally satisfied. His concern lay not in culinary perfection, but in whether breakfast interrupted the flow of his thoughts. Sometimes it barely interrupted them at all. His physicians occasionally encouraged a more balanced diet and slower eating habits, especially as digestive complaints became more frequent. They suggested that regular meals, eaten calmly, might ease the stomach pains that troubled him throughout much of his adult life. Napoleon listened politely, Then he returned to finishing breakfast in the time it took most people to decide whether they wanted jam or butter. As the last sip of coffee disappeared and the empty cup was quietly removed by waiting servants, the meal ended almost as quickly as it had begun. The Emperor rose from his chair, reached for another bundle of reports, and without a second thought left the breakfast table behind. Fortunately for his cooks, lunch and dinner offered slightly more opportunity to display their talents, especially when one particular chicken dish would become forever linked to Napoleon's name. Although Napoleon treated meals like military manoeuvres, there were still certain dishes that earned his approval. Some became genuine favourites, others became legends. None achieved greater fame than chicken Marengo. According to one of the most enduring stories in culinary history, the dish was born on the evening of the Battle of Marengo in 1800. Napoleon had just defeated the Austrian army in northern Italy after one of the most dramatic reversals of his military career. His chef, Dunand, supposedly found himself with almost no proper ingredients. Local villagers could provide only a chicken, tomatoes, eggs, garlic, olive oil, crayfish, and a little bread. So he improvised. The chicken was sautéed with tomatoes and garlic, the eggs were fried, the crayfish added for decoration, and toasted bread completed the meal. Napoleon reportedly enjoyed it so much that he requested the same dish after later victories, believing it had brought him good fortune. It is a wonderful story. Historians, however, are less convinced. Many culinary historians believe the famous recipe evolved decades later, and that the dramatic tale was embellished by later writers. Tomatoes were not yet common in many French kitchens, and the version served in restaurants today differs considerably from what might actually have appeared on Napoleon's table. Still, whether entirely true or partly fictional, chicken Marengo became permanently associated with the Emperor, and that in itself is a remarkable legacy for a single meal. Beyond the legends, Napoleon's real tastes were surprisingly straightforward. He enjoyed roasted chicken in many forms, appreciating its simplicity and reliability. Mutton appeared regularly on his table, often roasted or gently stewed with vegetables. Beef also featured in imperial meals, though rich sauces interested his chefs far more than they interested the emperor himself. He was particularly fond of simple soups. Lentil soup was among the dishes frequently mentioned by those close to him. Thick, warming and filling, it suited Napoleon's practical nature perfectly. Vegetable soups, onion soups and broths appeared often, especially during colder months or while travelling with the army. His Corsican upbringing also left lasting influences. Even after years spent ruling France, Napoleon never completely abandoned the Mediterranean flavours of his childhood. Olive oil, garlic, herbs, beans, and uncomplicated preparations reminded him of the island where he was born. While the imperial court celebrated elaborate French cuisine, Napoleon often preferred dishes that reminded him of home rather than displays of culinary extravagance. His cooks sometimes found this frustrating. French chefs of the early 19th century regarded cooking as a serious art. They spent hours preparing delicate sauces, intricate pastries, and beautifully presented courses designed to impress Europe's most powerful guests. Napoleon usually swallowed them before anyone had time to admire the presentation. Imagine spending 6 hours creating an edible masterpiece only to watch your guest finish it in under 5 minutes while reading military dispatches. The chef probably needed stronger medicine than the emperor. Desserts received slightly more attention. Napoleon enjoyed pastries from time to time and had a noticeable fondness for almonds and certain fruit preserves. Fresh fruit also appeared regularly when in season, particularly pears, cherries, grapes and apricots. Yet even sweets rarely persuaded him to slow his pace. For everyone else at court, dinner represented conversation, ceremony and entertainment. For Napoleon, it remained what it had always been. a brief stop before returning to the far more important business of conquering Europe. If Napoleon barely slowed down for dinner inside the Tuileries Palace, he certainly was not going to linger over meals while marching across Europe. Campaign life changed everything. Gone were the polished dining rooms, glittering chandeliers, and carefully arranged tables of Paris. Instead, meals were eaten inside command tents, abandoned farmhouses, monasteries, roadside inns, or occasionally in the open air while maps lay spread across folding tables. One day the emperor might dine in a royal palace. The next he could be eating from a simple plate while cannon fire echoed somewhere on the horizon. Napoleon accepted this without complaint. In fact, he often seemed more comfortable in the field than inside his own palaces. He believed a commander should remain close to his army, sharing many of its hardships, even if his accommodations were naturally more comfortable than those of an ordinary soldier. That did not mean he lived luxuriously. His travelling kitchen was surprisingly compact compared to the enormous baggage trains of many 18th century generals. Napoleon disliked unnecessary delays and constantly urged his officers to travel light. Every extra wagon slowed the army, and a slower army often meant giving the enemy valuable time. Speed won battles. Excess luggage lost them. His personal chef accompanied the campaign whenever possible, bringing essential cookware, spices, wines and ingredients that could be obtained along the route. Fresh supplies were purchased from towns, villages, monasteries, and local markets whenever circumstances allowed. If the army entered friendly territory, food was usually bought or requisitioned. In enemy lands, obtaining provisions became considerably more complicated. Some days the emperor enjoyed respectable meals. Roasted chicken, boiled beef, fresh vegetables, soup, bread, cheese and fruit might appear if the supply lines were functioning well. On particularly successful campaigns, local officials eager to impress the French emperor organised elaborate dinners inside captured cities. Napoleon rarely rewarded their efforts by eating slowly. His marshals had learned the routine. Just as everyone settled comfortably into their seats, Napoleon would finish his final mouthful, stand abruptly, and announce that there was work to do. Officers scrambled to follow him, abandoning half-finished meals because no one wished to keep the emperor waiting. Imagine finally getting a decent dinner after marching 20 miles, only to discover your commander has decided dessert is less important than discussing troop movements. History rarely sympathises with hungry marshals. Campaign conditions could also become extremely harsh. During the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, proper meals became almost impossible. As supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles and winter tightened its grip, even senior officers struggled to obtain sufficient food. Soldiers survived on coarse bread, horse meat, thin soup, frozen vegetables, or whatever could be scavenged from abandoned villages. Napoleon himself could not entirely escape these shortages, although his staff naturally tried to secure better provisions whenever possible. The contrast was remarkable. Only months earlier, imperial banquets had displayed the finest wines and silverware in Europe. Now the greatest ruler on the continent considered himself fortunate to receive a hot bowl of soup before returning to his maps. Whether inside a magnificent palace or a freezing command tent, one habit never changed. Napoleon still treated every meal as a brief interruption. His attention always remained fixed on the next march, the next battle, or the next decision that might determine the fate of an empire. While Napoleon hurried through his meals as though they were delaying a battle, an entire army of servants worked tirelessly to make those few minutes possible. The irony was almost comical. The emperor might spend 12 minutes eating. His kitchen had spent 12 hours preparing. Long before Napoleon entered the dining room, activity had already begun below stairs. The imperial kitchens were a world unto themselves, hidden from the glittering salons where diplomats and generals admired polished silver and crystal glasses. Here there was no elegance, only organised chaos. Large fireplaces roared from dawn until late at night. Copper pots hung above glowing coals. Knives struck chopping blocks with rhythmic precision. Fresh herbs filled the air with the scents of thyme, parsley, rosemary and bay leaves. Cooks hurried between ovens carrying roasting pans, while apprentices rushed to fetch butter, flour, wine, cream and vegetables from nearby storerooms. Everything had to be perfect, not because Napoleon was especially demanding about flavour, because serving the emperor was a matter of national prestige. At the head of this culinary operation stood the imperial chef, assisted by numerous specialists. One baker focused almost entirely on bread and pastries. Another prepared sauces, considered the soul of French cuisine. Others handled roasting, soups, desserts, or the careful preparation of fish and game. Every role mattered. A delayed sauce could hold up an entire meal. Napoleon, however, had very little patience for delays. His staff never knew exactly when he might decide he was hungry. Some evenings, dinner arrived at 6. On others, the emperor ignored food until nearly midnight, because he had become absorbed in military reports or meetings with ministers. The kitchen, therefore, remained in a constant state of readiness, with fires burning and ingredients prepared so a complete meal could appear almost immediately. Imagine running a restaurant where your only customer refuses to make reservations, and also happens to rule most of continental Europe. The food itself travelled through an elaborate chain before reaching the table. Kitchen servants arranged each course with extraordinary care. Silver serving dishes were polished until they reflected candlelight like mirrors. Fine porcelain from Sèvres often accompanied state dinners, while crystal decanters held carefully selected wines from Burgundy, Bordeaux, Champagne, and other celebrated regions of France. Then came one final challenge: getting the food to Napoleon while it was still hot. The imperial household employed servants whose sole responsibility was carrying dishes from the kitchens to the dining room in perfect condition. Timing mattered enormously. Soups cooled quickly. Sauces separated. Roasted meats lost their tenderness if they waited too long. Unfortunately for the cooks, Napoleon usually defeated them anyway. No sooner had the first course been placed before him than he had already begun eating with remarkable speed. Delicate garnishes, carefully arranged vegetables, and artistic presentation often escaped his notice entirely. The emperor was focused on satisfying his hunger, not admiring the chef's craftsmanship. His guests noticed everything. Foreign ambassadors frequently described the astonishing contrast between the magnificent quality of the food and the astonishing speed with which Napoleon consumed it. Many barely had time to begin their own meals before the emperor pushed back his chair and prepared to leave. For the kitchen staff, this created an unusual rhythm. Hours of careful preparation, minutes of frantic service, then silence. Yet, despite the emperor's indifference to ceremony, the imperial kitchen never lowered its standards. Every meal, whether eaten in 10 minutes or 2 hours, reflected the prestige of France itself. Because even if Napoleon viewed dinner as little more than another appointment, the rest of Europe was watching every course that appeared on his table. By now you may be wondering whether Napoleon ever actually enjoyed a meal. The answer is yes. He simply didn't enjoy spending much time eating it. His astonishing speed at the dinner table became one of his most recognizable personal habits. Diplomats mentioned it in their memoirs. Members of the imperial household joked about it. Even visitors seeing him dine for the first time often left amazed that one of the most powerful men in Europe could finish an elaborate meal before everyone else had reached their second course. The explanation was not that he disliked food. It was that his mind almost never stopped working. Napoleon possessed an extraordinary ability to concentrate for hours without interruption. Whether reviewing battle plans, reading reports from governors, correcting legal documents, or dictating letters to his secretaries, he became completely absorbed in the task before him. Meals interrupted that flow of thought. To him, dinner was not relaxation, it was an obstacle. Those closest to him noticed that he often continued thinking about military affairs even while eating. Secretaries sometimes stood nearby with notebooks, ready to record new instructions the moment an idea entered the emperor's mind. Between bites of roasted chicken or spoonfuls of soup, Napoleon might suddenly ask for casualty reports from Italy, request maps of the Rhine, or dictate changes to tomorrow's orders. Imagine trying to enjoy dessert while your boss decides this is the perfect moment to reorganize half of Europe. Conversation at the table reflected this habit. Unlike many monarchs, who used meals as opportunities for long discussions and entertainment, Napoleon frequently remained quiet. If he did speak, the topic was rarely light-hearted. Ministers could suddenly find themselves answering difficult political questions while attempting to butter a piece of bread. There was very little small talk, even less small dessert. His eating habits may also have been shaped by his years as a young artillery officer. Military life rarely encourages leisurely dining. Officers often learned to eat whenever food became available, because the next march, inspection, or battle could begin without warning. Those early habits remained with Napoleon long after he exchanged a lieutenant's uniform for an imperial crown. His physicians, however, viewed the situation differently. As the years passed, Napoleon increasingly complained of stomach pain, heartburn, indigestion, and occasional nausea. Doctors repeatedly suggested that eating too quickly prevented proper digestion. They advised him to chew more slowly, rest after meals, and reduce the constant pressure he placed upon himself. Their recommendations were perfectly sensible. Unfortunately, they were directed at Napoleon Bonaparte. He followed military timetables far more faithfully than medical advice. Modern historians have also suggested that stress played a significant role. Few rulers carried responsibilities on quite the same scale. At the height of his empire, Napoleon governed millions of people while directing campaigns across much of Europe. Every day brought diplomatic crises, military decisions, financial concerns, and political challenges that demanded immediate attention. Under those circumstances, it becomes easier to understand why dinner rarely occupied his full attention. Looking back, his rushed meals reveal something larger than an unusual table manner. They reveal a man who measured time differently from almost everyone around him. To Napoleon, every minute spent lingering over food was a minute that could have been spent planning a campaign, solving a political problem, or strengthening his empire. For better or worse, even the emperor's appetite marched at military speed. If Napoleon disliked spending time at the dinner table, there was one situation in which he had no choice: state banquets. An emperor could rush through a private meal. He could not rush through diplomacy, or at least he was expected not to. Throughout his reign, the imperial palaces of France hosted magnificent dinners for kings, princes, ambassadors, generals, scientists, and foreign dignitaries. These banquets were far more than opportunities to eat. They were carefully choreographed displays of power, wealth, and stability, designed to remind every guest that France stood at the centre of Europe. Every candle, every chair, every silver fork, every course served a political purpose. Preparations often began days in advance. The imperial kitchens selected the finest ingredients available from across France and beyond. Fresh fish arrived from the Atlantic coast. Oysters were transported with astonishing speed to remain fresh. Rare wines came from Burgundy, Bordeaux, and Champagne. Exotic fruits, expensive spices, and delicate pastries demonstrated not only culinary excellence, but also the enormous reach of Napoleon's empire and trade networks. The dining room itself became a stage. Long tables gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Gold-trimmed porcelain from the famous Sèvres factory reflected hundreds of candle flames. Fresh flowers decorated the centerpieces, while polished silverware was arranged with military precision. Servants in immaculate uniforms stood silently behind every chair, ready to replace plates almost before guests realized they had finished. Nothing was accidental. Even the seating plan required careful thought. An ambassador from Austria could not simply be placed anywhere. A visiting king expected precedence over lesser nobles. Distinguished marshals of France occupied positions reflecting both military achievement and political importance. One misplaced guest could create an international insult before the soup had even arrived.